Welcome back to Radio Free Butte Hold. I'm your host, bloodydoves, and today we're talking about combat vehicles in BattleTech. We're going to cover tabletop primarily, and then we're going to talk a little bit about the video games, how they get them wrong, and how they maybe kind of get them a little right. Before we get started, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and leave me a comment down below about your favorite combat vehicle in BattleTech and why it's the Alicorn. It better be the Alicorn. I want to see someone say it's the Alicorn. The Alicorn is great. Anyway, leave me a comment down below. I'd actually love to hear what your favorite combat vehicle is, because there are so many cool combat vehicles, and I'd love to hear about them. But before we get started, we have to define something. What the hell is a combat vehicle? BattleTech has a lot of non-mech things in it. If you're not familiar, BattleTech has so much stuff in it that it's actually kind of bananas. So, for this definition, I am talking about a very specific thing, which is the thing when I say tank that your brain probably immediately thinks about, which is a ground combat vehicle with the hover, wheel, or tracked motive types. I'm not talking about helicopters. I'm not talking about aerospace fighters. I'm not talking about dropships or mobile structures or large craft like BattleTech movers or trains or blue water boats. I'm not talking about Blackwater Navy. I'm not talking about infantry or jeeps. I'm not talking about any of that. I'm talking about combat vehicles, ground combat vehicles that are hovercraft, wheeled vehicles, or tracked vehicles. That's what we're discussing today, because that's what a tank, quote-unquote, is. So, Hetzer, yes. Lightning Aerospace, no. There we go. Now, the rest of those things are all actually interesting to talk about, especially kind of aerospace fighters. I think I might want to do an episode on aerospace fighters. But all of that is very different. We might very briefly cover one or two of them, but probably not. We'll see where the whim takes me, but we're probably just going to talk about standard ground combat vehicles. So I'm just going to shortcut it with tanks, because that's what they are. They're tanks. And when I say tanks, I want you to know what I'm talking about. So with that in mind, let's move on. Tanks and why they're bad on table. And this is the sad part, because this is where we have to talk about why tanks are crap. Tanks are very often derided and dismissed by longtime players, and for pretty good reasons. Tanks are hysterically easy to neutralize. Note, I didn't say destroy, I said neutralize. And the reason that they're so easy to neutralize is their hit tables, and the way that you harm tanks. So, tanks have pretty bad hit location tables. So, the hit location table, for those of you who are not super familiar with BattleTech, is when you make an attack against an enemy in BattleTech, you roll to hit, and then you roll for the location that your hit goes to. So you spread the damage around, because the hits usually meander around, because you have no control over that roll. There are different tables for what direction your attacks are coming from, whether they're coming out on the front, or the side, or the rear. Tanks have a front/rear table. They have a front table, they have a rear table, and they have a side table. And the side table is the same for the left side and the right side. It's just side, and you take damage on the side you're being shot from. The problem with the hit tables for tanks is that, unlike mechs, tanks have a lot of extra stuff on the hit table. Not just the location, but you hit the location and you get a free bonus for rolling that number. On mechs, the hit tables are you just hit the location, you do damage, that's it. Except on a 2, which is a center torso possible crit check. So you hit the center torso, if you roll a 2 with your medium laser, you do 5 damage to center torso, and then you get a chance for a through armor critical. So no matter if you broke the armor or not, you get a critical check. Tanks have that same mechanic on multiple locations on their hit tables. So on tanks, for the front and rear tables, if you roll a 2 or you roll a 12, you get the damage to the indicated location, and you get a critical damage check. On the sides, you get it on 2, 12, and 8, which is so awful, it's hilarious. The thing is, unlike mechs, where critical damage is just damage to whatever's in the location that you're damaging, so it could be nothing, it could be a random heatsink, it could be an ammo bin and blow your mech up, it could be whatever's in the location. On tanks, they don't have that, because they don't assign stuff to locations internally like that. They kind of do, but not really. They have a critical damage table. That table has a lot of bad things on it. So it could be your turret, if they hit the turret, your turret locks. It could be they destroy a weapon in the location. They have a malfunction in a weapon in the location. They have an ammunition explosion, which is an auto kill on the tank. They could stun the crew. They could kill the crew outright. It's bad. Critical damage is cripplingly terrible. They could also like hit the fuel tank and blow it up. I mean, there's a lot of options, and they are all pretty terrible. So what could happen is the enemy shoots you on the front table on the first turn of the game with an AC2. They roll a 2. They get front damage, possible crit. They roll a crit. They go, okay, we hit ammunition. Is there an ammo-using weapon in the location? You go, yes, there is. And like, there's the ammo. Boom, the tank explodes. You're dead. Sucks for you. That's a thing that can happen. Now, that can happen on mechs too, but on tanks, you have multiple chances per hit table. If it's coming on the side, there are 3 locations on the hit table out of 11. There's only 11 locations on the table. There are 3 on the side where that's a thing. And this is not the only extra thing on the hit tables, which is the second issue. Tanks also have what's called motive damage, which is damage to the motive system of the tank. So your hovercraft skirts or your wheels or your treads. The ability you use to get around. These are also indicated on the hit table. On the front and rear tables, there are 4 locations. There's 4 locations on the front and rear tables, and there's 4 locations on the side tables. Which means that on the front and rear tables, 6 out of 11 locations have extra stuff attached, be it motive or critical damage. And on the side tables, it's 7 out of 11 locations have extra stuff indicated. It's bad. Motive damage can be fine. You can roll nothing. You can roll nothing on crit damage too. 2 through 5 on the crit check is nothing. You can roll nothing on the motive table, or you can roll a penalty to your driving skill rolls, and all the other ones are penalties to your movement. So a -1 to your cruising MP, which adjusts your flanking MP, which is like run and, or like walk and run for mechs. Cruise is walk, flank is run. So you could have your penalty, your movement drop by 1, or you have your movement cut in half, or you could be totally immobilized just instantly. You can easily go, shoot you on the side with an AC5, get a motive crit, roll 11 on the motive crit, have your movement. Done. Sucks for you. Oh, you were an 812 hovercraft? Well, you're a 4.6 now. And you might be thinking, BD, that doesn't sound like it's going to happen that often. It happens a lot. The last time I took tanks out on a battlefield, the very first turn of combat, one of the players had a Saladin, which is an AC-20 hovercraft, that's an 812. It got halved in movement speed on the first turn of combat. The first turn it got shot at, its movement got cut in half immediately. There you go. It just happens. Tanks are just fragile. And the thing that makes this even worse for tanks is that despite having very good armoring, which we'll talk about later, these effects make them so easy to neutralize because they're on the hit tables. You don't have to hit structure, you just have to hit them at all, which is brutal. The thing that makes it the worst part about this is the way you damage tanks and the way the hit locations are set up. So for this exercise, I'm going to need you to imagine a hex. You're looking down at a hex, okay? The front face is facing up. So it's facing up, and there's 2 on the left, 2 on the right, and 1 on the rear. In the center of the hex, there's a unit. We're going to talk about both a mech and a tank, and we're going to talk about how the hit facings work. So you got to imagine this in your mind. So put a mech in the middle of that hex, okay? Doesn't matter what mech. Let's say an Atlas, okay? There's an Atlas in the middle of that hex. He's facing up. He's facing the front face of the hex, the front facing of the hex. For mechs, when you attack a mech, if it comes through the front 3 hex sides, you're going to be on the front table. The front 3 hex sides are the one that the mech is facing, and the one on the left and the one on the right. So if you're looking at that Atlas, the one that he's facing and the hex facing on that left and that right, that's the front arc for a mech. Attacks coming in through those hex sides come in on the front table. This is good, because the front table is very good for mechs. It's got every hit location on it. You can kind of spread damage around, and the 6, 7, and 8, the most common results on the table, are your torsos. So your presumably best armored locations where you can soak a lot of fire. The left, right, and rear facings are the back 3, and I feel like you should be able to piece together which is which. Very easy. For tanks, this is not the case. For tanks, the front arc is only the front hex facing that the tank is looking directly at. The left 2 hex facings and the right 2 hex facings on the sides of the hex are the side table. As we talked about, the side table is very bad because the side table has 7 out of 11 locations on the side table that have motive crit or critical damage. which means that if most of your shots, 4 out of 6 facings on your hex, are side tables, you're getting shot in the sides a lot. And if you're getting shot in the sides a lot, there's a lot of chance for your enemy to roll motive damage or critical damage, which is terrible. This is very bad. The rear facing, of course, is just the last hex slot on the bottom of the tank. So, tanks not only have bad hit tables, but they're also taking damage on those bad hit tables the majority of the time. Now, this makes intuitive sense, because if you look at a tank, like a real world, like you look at an Abrams tank, they're long, and they're relatively low, and they're long and they're narrow, because that's kind of how vehicles sort of operate, right? Like, that's how a vehicle sort of is. A bus, a vehicle that was wider than it was deep is weird to consider. That'd be a very strange vehicle, and while I'm sure that they exist, I've never seen one. Cars and tanks and things are long and they are narrow, so it makes logical sense that the side table should be the majority of their hit table. But the side table was also designed to be really crippling to tanks. So if you look at this and you kind of put these two things together, you can see, okay, tanks are very easily disabled. We can cripple their turret, we can stun the crew, which neutralizes the tank's turn, we can blow up an ammo bin, we can motive crit them into being a pillbox, which is where you are... Pillboxed is when you are set to 0 movement, and you become a little bunker, basically, a little bunker with a gun. You can very easily neutralize tanks in a way that is really bad for them. And it looks like, if you look at just this, you can go, wow, tanks kind of suck. This is terrible. Like, why would you ever want to use tanks? They seem really bad. And that's true until you dig a little further. Because tanks have a lot of extra advantage that mechs kind of don't share and is worth discussing. So, tanks and why they're actually good on table. The good things about tanks. So tanks do have some interesting advantages. The first one is that, if you'll forgive the joke, tanks are pretty tanky. They have a lot of armor. Like, a lot of armor. If you can dodge motive damage or critical damage, or you're already in a good firing position and you don't care about motive damage, which happens more than you might think, tanks can actually soak a lot of fire. And if you're pillboxed, if you've got ranged weapons and your turret still moves, it doesn't matter. You can still be dangerous. An alicorn or a Shrek in a good firing position is actually really terrifying. Because especially when you're pillboxed, well, you're not moving, so you have no movement penalties, so you're just going to open fire every turn just until you die. Tanks, so the thing with tanks is that tanks have a lot of armor because they can carry as much or more armor than a mech of their equivalent weight, but they have a lot less locations to spread that armor over. So let's talk about the Behemoth. Behemoth is a 100-ton assault tank. The standard Behemoth has 13 tons of armor, which is as much as a well-armored inner sphere heavy mech. Not an assault, a heavy. That Behemoth with 13 tons of armor has 46 armor on its front and its turret, has 38 per side, and has 40 in the rear. The Atlas, for the record, with 19.5 tons of armor, has, I think, 42 or 45 in the center torso, its most heavily defended location. The Behemoth has more than that in 2 locations, and it has 6 less tons of total armor. The Behemoth also has, that Behemoth, for the record, has 2 AC-10s, 4 machine guns, 20 total SRMs, and 20 total LRMs. Now, it's slow, it's a 2-3, because it had to give up something. But it is incredibly armored, and it has a lot of guns. And that's not the most armored Behemoth. There's a Behemoth called the Behemoth Armor variant that has 21 tons of armor, which is more than pretty much any mech can carry, which works out to 61 points per side, 74 on the front and turret, and 66 in the rear. 74 front armor is enough to soak 3 AC-20s and not break armor. It can soak almost 5 Gauss rifles. 5 Gauss rifles is 75 damage. The 5th Gauss rifle does 1 damage to structure. 5 Gauss rifles. That is a ridiculous amount of armor. Like, just absurd. Think about that for a second. And that behemoth, by the way, still has like 2 AC-10s and the SRMs and the LRMs. I don't think it has the machine guns, but it still has most of the other firepower. And it's got an unbelievable amount of armor. There's no mech that can match that without like hardened armor quad mech memes. Like, you can't match that amount of armor with anything because that amount of armor is ridiculously insane. It's still slow, but like, you get a lot for your value with the behemoth. And that's just a random assault tank I picked because I remembered it off the top of my head. The second thing is, tanks are cheap. Tanks are really, really cheap. The standard 13-ton of armor behemoth is 1,406 BV. For context, a Thunderbolt 5 SE, which is a jumping Thunderbolt, an Intratech jumping Thunderbolt, has 1,414 BV. So it costs an extra 8 BV. It has the same amount of armor as that behemoth, but it has worse values in every location. The behemoth has more on its sides than the Thunderbolt does on its center torso. It's not by much, but it's by enough. The Thunderbolt also has a lot worse firepower, because the Thunderbolt has a large laser and an LRM rack and some mediums. And that's it. And the behemoth has like 80 plus damage before the machine guns. The Thunderbolt has like less than half of that. The Thunderbolt's only real advantage is it's a mech. So it's more durable because it has better hit tables, and it's a 4.64. So it's more maneuverable. But like, that's it. Suddenly, even though the behemoth has the bad hit tables, suddenly it looks like a pretty good deal. And the behemoth is also a lot cheaper in C-bills. The Thunderbolt is 5.5 million C-bills, and the behemoth is 2.9. Which means that if you're playing in a campaign where you're actually tracking C-bills or you're tracking war chest points, that behemoth is a really good deal. That behemoth becomes pretty cheap. And this is an assault tank. This isn't even like an actually cheap tank like a Savannah Master or a Hetzer. The stock AC-20 Hetzer is 574 BV and 656,000 C-bills. For the C-bill cost of a Thunderbolt, you can have like 8 Hetzers. For the BV cost of a Thunderbolt, you can have like 2.5 to 3 Hetzers, depending on, 3 is a little more, it'd be like 1,600 BV. But like, you can have like 3 Hetzers for one Thunderbolt. And no, the Hetzer's only a 4.6 with an AC-20, and it's got a lot of issues, but it's actually got comparable armor to the Thunderbolt per facing. And it's got an AC-20. And it's funnier. And I've got 3 of them. The Thunderbolt is more versatile, but it's also just less armed and less armored, and yeah, my Hetzer is a lot cheaper. And the best thing is the Hetzer and the Behemoth are both internal combustion engines, so I can buy a Hetzer like on any planet that has gasoline and a factory. Whereas buying a Thunderbolt is actually tough because the Thunderbolt requires a fusion engine and is expensive to build and requires specialized factories. Hetzers you can build in a cave with a box of scraps like Tony Stark. You can build Hetzers out of like anything. The Germans, I think, proved that you could do that with the actual real world Hetzer. You can build like tanks out of nothing, whereas Thunderbolts are actually tough to build. So they are cheap, and you can have a lot of them for the price of a mech, and that's a big advantage for tanks. The third advantage for tanks is a little more niche. It's about terrain. So mechs are 2 levels high, and tanks are 1 level high. This means that a level 1 hill blocks line of sight to a tank, but it does not block it to a mech, because the mech peeks out over the hill. This is good for the mech, because the mech can shoot over the hill, and the tank cannot. But it also means the mech can be shot over the hill, and the tank cannot, because the tank can't be seen. This lets you use tanks with terrain to kind of effectively get around the fact that they're not that fast, and they're typically kind of short range, because they've got a lot of like heavy short range weapons like AC-10s and AC-20s. By kind of hiding them in the shadow of terrain and kind of creeping them up on people, you can like sneak up on people with tanks in a way that you kind of can't with mechs. It's harder with mechs because mechs are tall. It's kind of a niche advantage, but it's an interesting advantage that tanks have. Finally, the last interesting thing that tanks have that mechs do not is tanks actually have what's called the Vehicle Effectiveness Optional Rule. This is in Tactical Operations. I don't have a page number for you because my version of TAC Ops is several editions ago, and it's a single book, and Catalyst recently split TAC Ops into 2 books, and I don't know which of the 2 books this rule is in. It's called the Vehicle Effectiveness Rule. It is an optional rule. You'll want to clear it with your group before you play with it. But what it does is it makes tanks a lot better by adjusting their hit tables, by removing some of the motive damage and critical damage locations. So suddenly tanks become a lot beefier, which is a big deal. That's a really big buff to tanks. And if you want to play with it and you want tanks to be better, try that rule out. It's worth checking out. So that's tanks on table. But what about tanks in the video games? So in the video games, we're only going to talk about MechWarrior 5, and we're talking about Harebrained Schemes BattleTech, HP's BattleTech. And the reality is, the games don't do great. The games don't do a great job. Both games kind of treat tanks the same way. They're fragile, but they're dangerous. They do it in different ways, though. So in MechWarrior 5, tanks have one hit location, just the tank, and kind of a casual amount of damage sort of blows them up, just sort of pops tanks easily. The other thing is you can just stomp over a tank. If you're driving like a heavy mech or a medium mech, you can just like walk straight through a tank and it'll just explode. That's really cinematic and cool, but it also means that tanks are kind of totally irrelevant. If you can catch them, and most tanks are slow, you can just sort of stomp over them or like hit them with the melee weapons because they introduced melee. You can just like smack them with a hatchet and they just explode instantly. It's cool looking. It's fun. But it also makes tanks kind of a non-issue. In Harebrained Schemes BattleTech, tanks have multiple hit locations like they do on table. They got the two sides, the front, the back, and the turret. But tanks are fragile. They have their cannon loadouts, they have a lot of guns, but HP's BattleTech actually has a hidden multiplier that adjusts their armor and structure, and it brings the armor and structure down to make them more fragile than they should otherwise be. Now you can go into your game files and you can change that. It's an edit. Players aren't supposed to be able to make that edit, but you can. It's available. You can find that setting and change it so that that's not the case. And if you do, tanks become really good because the motive damage and the crit damage tables don't exist. So you have to burn through all the armor, and like we talked about, there's a lot of armor on tanks. I get why they did it, but it does mean that like MechWarrior 5, players look at them and go, wow, tanks are really bad. Tanks just explode super easy, and they're very, very easy. And I actually have a lot of experience with this because with BattleTech Advanced 3062, the mod pack that I make, we unnerfed tanks. And a lot of players have trouble with tanks because they become much more durable without those tabletop-style hit tables to kind of penalize them. It's an interesting balance that you have to make with the video games, because if you don't have those hit tables and you have them have their standard durability, tanks become very beefy. But if you introduce those hit tables like tabletop does, tanks become trivial. They become easily neutralized and kind of a joke. It's a really interesting balance the way that BattleTech has done tanks. I'm not sure that I like it. And so the question is, should you use tanks on table? And the answer is yes, you should. One, they're different, and they're interesting, and they're worth playing with. And two, as long as you go into it knowing their limitations and knowing that they're not mechs, and they're not going to behave like the mechs, they're not going to be able to soak fire like mechs, I think you will have a good time with tanks. Are they perfect? No. Are they good? Yes, I think they are. They're definitely not perfect, but they've got some good advantages to them, and you can get some really fun gun breaks. And there's actually a lot of really cool tanks. I'm a huge fan of like the Alicorn with triple Gauss rifles. I love the Regulator, which is a hovercraft with a Gauss rifle. Love that tank. Love the Shrek. I actually really like the Partisan. I like the Demolisher in all of its various forms. All the weapon carriers like the LRM carrier and the SRM carrier are classic and very fun to play with. There's a lot of cool tanks in the game, and they're definitely worth checking out. So give those a look sometime. Play with them on table. See what you think. Get at me in the comments. I want to hear what you have to say. Hopefully you've enjoyed the talk about tanks today. If there's interest, we might talk about aerospace sometime. I think aerospace fighters and the way aerospace combat works is actually pretty unique and might be worth a topic. If you're interested in hearing about that, maybe let me know in the comments. But that's it for Radio Free Butte Hold today. I've been Bloody Doves. Don't forget to do the like and subscribe and comment and YouTube jazz. I really appreciate it. And until next time, live free, ride hard, and never trust Comstar, tank warriors.